All right, let's dive right into what is honestly a mind-blowing explainer today, uncovering the totally hidden story of salt, geography, and heart health across Africa. We usually just think of the food on our plates as a matter of personal choice, or maybe just modern convenience. But today, we're going to look way past the salt shaker and unpack a centuries-old geographic and economic saga that is literally shaping public health. Picture this, because it's essentially a 1,000-year time jump on one slide. On one side, you've got a medieval 90-kilogram slab of rock salt, carved out of the Sahara, trekking for weeks on a camel to Timbuktu. Back then, it was a substance literally worth its weight in gold. Fast forward to today, and picture a teenager in Lagos dropping a cheap, foil-wrapped bouillon cube into her jollof rice. Inside that one tiny cube is actually more sodium than her body needs for 2 whole days. But first, we gotta talk biology for a second to really grasp the scale of this shift. Our bodies need just a tiny, tiny fraction of salt to survive. The actual physiological requirement is somewhere between 10 and 20 millimoles a day. Honestly, that's well under 2 grams of salt. That minuscule amount is all it takes to keep your nerves firing properly and to stop your muscles from cramping up. So here's the absolute magic number to keep in your head: 5 grams. The World Health Organization recommends a strict maximum of 5 grams of salt per day, which is about 1 level teaspoon. And keep in mind, this ceiling is set specifically for cardiovascular health, not just basic survival. It's the absolute maximum we should be consuming. But then, you look at the real-world data and wow, 81% of adult populations studied in sub-Saharan Africa are just completely blowing through this WHO limit. We're seeing urban Nigeria hitting around 10 grams a day, and Benin, they're more than doubling the WHO ceiling at a staggering 11.3 grams per day. So how exactly did a historically scarce mineral become such an overwhelming presence in the modern diet?
Which brings us to Part 1, the geographic mystery. Why on earth was salt so scarce to begin with?
Well, to understand why consumption is so intensely high today, we literally have to look at the ancient geological map. The African continent was shaped by this fundamental salt geography that has dictated diets for a millennium. If you live near the ocean, the Mediterranean, or inland salt lakes, you were set. The salt would just crust on the ground. But if you lived in the vast tropical interior, the great forest zones and savannas, you had absolutely none. Imagine living in a hot, humid climate where you're sweating constantly, and you have zero natural salt to preserve your food before it spoils.
And this absolute scarcity? It kicked off the legendary trans-Saharan trade. Massive camel caravans would carry salt south, charging an 80% transportation fee just to get it there. Think about that. It was so rare it traded weight for weight with gold. Because of this, a really deep culinary culture emerged in the interior, where cooking with abundant salt became a celebrated marker of wealth, generosity, and basically having finally escaped poverty.
All right, moving into Part 2, the bouillon cube revolution.
So, the late 19th century rolls around, and this European invention drops in and completely rewrites history, effectively rebranding that cultural memory of salt. Looking at this timeline, we see the birth of the bouillon cube. Julius Maggi had the idea back in 1872, and by 1910, companies like Oxo and Knorr were rolling out their own. As these cubes traveled along colonial trade routes, they hit West and Central Africa and just became an indispensable, foundational element of everyday cooking. Fast forward to 2016, and an astonishing 65 billion of these little cubes were sold in West and Central Africa alone. Billion with a B. And this is the ultimate paradox right here. These little cubes basically weaponize that ancient cultural memory of salt scarcity. They are packed with up to 60% salt, combined with MSG and other flavor enhancers that trigger this incredible, deep umami response. Food scientists literally call them well-packaged salt. They deliver that historically prized, rich, savory flavor, but now in this incredibly cheap, shelf-stable, everyday package.
Let's look at Part 3, mapping modern consumption.
So where is all this salt actually coming from today? It's kind of a giant puzzle. As you can see, the source changes drastically depending on where you look. In North Africa, the main culprit is highly salted staple breads. Over in East Africa, it's salt-heavy spice powders like berbere. Down in Southern Africa, the diet has been heavily taken over by processed foods, cereals, and cured meats. But then you have this massive bouillon belt that just absolutely dominates West and Central Africa. Now, across all these regions, there is one undeniable trend. Urbanization is a massive salt accelerator. As cities grow at lightning speed, urban populations are eating way more salt than rural ones. The shift away from traditional, potassium-rich whole foods over to processed, bouillon-heavy, and restaurant meals is just compounding these health risks at an unprecedented speed. Okay, to pull all of this together, we can look at these 5 colliding forces. The ancient geology that created the scarcity, the culinary culture that prized savory flavors, the colonial commerce that introduced the bouillon cube, the rapid urbanization shifting modern diets, and finally, the rather patchy modern policy regulation. These 5 elements are exactly why the map of salt consumption looks the way it does today.
So, what does this all mean for the people actually living there? It's time to connect the dots and ask the big question of this explainer. What actually happens to the human body when our basic biology collides with a food environment that is utterly saturated with historically driven sodium? That takes us to part 4, the hypertension crisis.
The fallout of all this hidden sodium is a massive medical crisis, but it doesn't look quite like what we see in the West. In high-income countries, ischemic heart disease, like heart attacks, tends to be the leading threat. But in Africa, stroke is the dominant and most deadly cardiovascular threat. And the statistics are just sobering. 94% of stroke deaths in people under 70 occur in low and middle-income countries, and this is heavily driven by uncontrolled high blood pressure. Get this, a recent systematic review shows that roughly 27% of adults in sub-Saharan Africa are dealing with hypertension. That's more than 1 in 4 people. And in some regions, like Central and West Africa, that average climbs well past 30%, with estimates in Southern Africa currently pushing past 34%.
But honestly, the prevalence is only half the story. The control crisis is where things get truly staggering. Think about this drop-off. Across 37 African countries, while 62% of hypertensive women actually know they have the condition, only 15% receive treatment. And the control rate, meaning those who are actually managing their blood pressure effectively, it's a stunningly low 7.3% for women, and for men, just 3.7%. Across the continent, fewer than 1 in 20 hypertensive adults actually has their blood pressure under control.
Okay, let's pivot to part 5, paths to prevention. Because the good news? This isn't just some inevitable natural disaster. It's a structural problem, which means we can actually fix it with proven policy solutions. Some governments are already stepping up in a huge way. South Africa enacted the world's first mandatory maximum sodium limits on processed foods, a move that's projected to prevent over 7,400 cardiovascular deaths every single year. Senegal instituted a strict legal limit for the salt content specifically in bouillon cubes, and Ethiopia launched a massive national mass media campaign to actively warn citizens about high-salt foods.
There's this incredibly powerful quote from the source text that just hits the nail on the head. The geography of salt is also tragically the geography of cardiovascular care. The extreme urban-rural divides in salt intake perfectly mirror the terrifying inequities in medical access. So a rural resident might eat far less salt than someone in the city, but they also have drastically less access to a simple blood pressure cuff or a life-saving prescription if their pressure does eventually rise. It's a brutal double whammy.
So, as we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with this pivotal thought. To actually fix global health, we have to stop treating diseases as just random, isolated events. We've got to start looking at the deep historical shadows, the centuries of trade, the geography, and the colonial structures that are actively shaping what is on our plates today. The policy levers totally exist to change this, and honestly, learning to see these hidden structures is the very first step.